In the early 20th century, long before the Cold War had a name, two brothers were being groomed not for politics, but for power. John Foster Dulles and Alan Welsh Dulles were born into privilege, diplomacy, and quiet influence. Their family tree was filled with missionaries, diplomats, and statesmen, men who believed America had a moral duty to shape the world. This belief would later become something far darker. While most Americans would never know their names, the decisions made by these two brothers would redraw borders, topple governments, and define how the United States exercised power in secret. This is not the story of presidents or elections. This is the story of the men behind the curtain. John Foster Dulles was the elder brother, rigid, moralistic, deeply religious, and absolutely convinced that history had chosen him. Alan Dulles, the younger, was his opposite. Charming, social, adaptable, and comfortable in moral gray zones. Together, they formed a perfect machine. One brother would speak in absolutes, framing conflicts as good versus evil. The other would operate in shadows, pulling strings quietly. They did not just believe in American power. They believed they understood the world better than the world understood itself. Both brothers were educated at elite institutions and entered public life early. John Foster worked as a lawyer negotiating international treaties, while Alan drifted naturally into intelligence work during World War II. Alan became part of the OSS, the CIA's predecessor, where deception, manipulation, and psychological warfare were treated as tools of survival. War taught Alan that truth was flexible. Victory mattered more than morality. When the war ended, the brothers didn't return to normal life. Instead, they helped design the post-war world. After World War II, the United States emerged as a global superpower, but it feared losing control. The Soviet Union, once an ally, was now an ideological enemy. The Cold War was not just about weapons. It was about influence. John Foster Dulles believed communism was a disease that must be eradicated everywhere. No neutral ground, no compromise. Alan Dulles, now deeply embedded in intelligence circles, believed democracy could be engineered, sometimes violently. In 1953, their moment arrived. President Dwight D. Eisenhower appointed John Foster Dulles as Secretary of State. Alan Dulles became director of the CIA. Never before had two brothers controlled both American diplomacy and secret operations at the same time. One spoke openly to the world, the other reshaped it silently. John Foster Dulles introduced a harsh worldview. Nations were either with the United States or against it. He rejected diplomacy with communist states and promoted the idea of massive retaliation. Any challenge to U.S. interests, anywhere on Earth, could be treated as a global threat. This black-and-white thinking left no room for local realities. To John Foster, elected leaders who challenged American corporations were just as dangerous as Soviet agents. Meanwhile, Alan Dulles transformed the CIA into something unprecedented. Intelligence gathering was no longer enough. The CIA would now interfere directly in other nations, funding opposition groups, spreading propaganda, bribing officials, and orchestrating coups. Alan believed secrecy made actions righteous. If Americans didn't know, they wouldn't object. If history didn't record it, it wouldn't judge. Under the Dulles brothers, foreign policy became a performance. Public speeches promised freedom. Secret files authorized chaos. Democratically elected leaders were labeled threats. Nations seeking independence were treated as enemies. The brothers didn't just fight communism, they fought any challenge to American economic dominance: oil, fruit, minerals, influence. Iran was one of the first testing grounds. When Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized oil, John Foster framed it as communist expansion. Alan Dulles framed it as a covert problem. Together, they approved a plan to destabilize Iran from within. Propaganda, bribery, staged protests. The coup succeeded. A democracy fell. A monarchy rose. The long-term consequences would echo for decades. Guatemala followed. President Jacobo Arbenz attempted land reforms that threatened American corporate interests. Again, John Foster condemned him publicly. Again, Allen Dulles orchestrated his removal quietly. A CIA-backed coup plunged Guatemala into decades of violence. To the brothers, it was a success. To the people living there, it was a nightmare. The Dulles brothers never saw these operations as crimes. They saw themselves as guardians of order. In their minds, history demanded sacrifices. Countries were chessboards, people were pieces. Democracy was conditional. Stability mattered more than choice. Their influence extended beyond coups. They shaped NATO strategy, nuclear doctrine, and global propaganda campaigns. John Foster Dulles's speeches hardened Cold War rhetoric, while Allen Dulles's CIA experimented with psychological operations, surveillance, and influence campaigns that blurred ethical lines permanently. Criticism began to grow quietly. Some journalists noticed patterns. Some allies felt manipulated. But secrecy protected the brothers. Files were classified. Mistakes were buried. Failures were reframed as victories. The illusion shattered in Cuba. The Bay of Pigs invasion, planned under Allen Dulles, failed catastrophically. The CIA had underestimated reality and overestimated its own power. The world watched as America was humiliated. For the first time, the shadow empire was visible. President Kennedy lost trust in the intelligence community. Allen Dulles was dismissed. John Foster Dulles had already passed away, never seeing the full consequences of the system he helped build. But their architecture remained. Even after losing power, Allen Dulles remained influential. He served on commissions, advised presidents, and helped shape how history would remember intelligence failures. The system protected its architects. Today, many of the world's conflicts trace back to decisions made quietly during the Dulles era. Borders drawn without consent, leaders removed without accountability, resentments planted and left to grow. The Dulles brothers did not invent covert power, but they perfected it. They normalized intervention. They proved secrecy could outrun democracy. Their legacy is not one of villains or heroes, but of consequences. They believed they were saving the world. Instead, they taught it a dangerous lesson, that power, when hidden, rarely answers to morality. This is why their story matters, because the shadows they built are still with us. And history, once hidden, always finds its way back into the light.